A few days ago, I published a video called What is Privilege as part of the Trigger Warning project, which I'm going to elaborate on in a wee moment. But first of all, I want to explain and apologise for the sarcastic tone that I took when I was discussing the concept of a trigger warning. For anyone who doesn't know, the trigger warning, the purpose of the trigger warning is primarily to forewarn people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of a traumatic event in their lives, whether that be have been in a war zone, have been violently beaten up or raped, sexually abused, whatever may have happened. And so the concept of the trigger warning is absolutely rooted in protecting people from exposing themselves to something that might trigger a strong psychological physical reaction. Now, as someone who has experienced strong symptoms of it in the past, although less and less as I get older, I can say that it is no fun, and that as much as I've never actually had a trigger warning or seen a trigger warning or required a trigger warning, I would never deny someone else the right to such a thing, depending on where they might be at. When I referred to the trigger warning sarcastically, I very much had a caricature in my mind, and this is something that maybe people can relate to when they discuss certain subjects or topics. We can accidentally discuss them in a disparaging manner. The sarcasm comes out of us sideways because we have a caricature in our mind of the type of person that would engage in whatever behaviour it is that we are imminently going to criticise. So, upon reflection and upon people drawing to my attention this area where they felt that I was perhaps lacking a certain sensitivity, I've decided upon reflection that while being critical of the concept of a trigger warning in specific contexts, there's not necessarily any requirement for me to also be sarcastic and disparaging, because that might be misinterpreted and might actually undermine my attempts to illuminate the issue in some way. So, with that said, I would just like to discuss very, very quickly what the idea behind the trigger warning project is generally, and also what inspired it. So in 2014, Scotland had the independence referendum. I was involved in that, as were so many other people. Even people that weren't involved in it were involved in it in some way. It was all encompassing and very much set the tone for how life would turn out in Scotland post referendum, which was a landscape dominated by constitutional politics, constitutional theories, debate, and so on and so forth. Now, when I was campaigning for a yes vote, and it was because I was inspired by the messages that the Yes campaign were putting out there, the mainstream Yes campaign and the radical independence campaign. And the closer and closer that we got to the referendum, the more sceptical I began to become about certain aspects of the Yes movement, because I began to see a lack of concern for facilitating things like democracy in our own ranks. The whole demand for democracy, the whole drive towards independence, was based on an argument about a democratic deficit. And so I couldn't quite reconcile how some organisations and groups, which were actually amassing for themselves quite considerable cultural capital and political capital, how they had no real concept of how to facilitate democratic structures or even democratic conversations in their own ranks. And so then this led me to the 18th of September, the 19th of September, when the vote actually happened, and it was a no vote. Half of the country was heartbroken, but by this point I was actually so quite alienated and disillusioned by some of what I'd experienced in the Yes movement that I was quite numb. Now, after that, I had a choice. I could get angry and upset and decide that everyone who voted no fell into a certain type of category, right? So they were bigots, or they were selfish middle class sociopaths detached from the reality of poverty, and so on and so forth. Either way, it would have required a massive assumption on my part about more than half of the society in which I lived. And as tempting as it was to be emotionally indignant, now I don't mean to be disparaging about people who might share the beliefs that I'm referring to, but for me personally, I wasn't satisfied that that was rational. I didn't want to fence myself off because I had made so many assumptions that the yes movement was moral, and the closer we got to the referendum, the more I began to realise that in essence, was quite rhetorical, and that there is a moral case to be made for independence, but perhaps the one that we were given then wasn't quite as moral. So once you decide that you're not going to fence yourself off, and that you were wrong about some things, then you have to go and talk to the people who voted no, and you have to try and understand why. And the more that I done that, the more I started to see similarities in a lot of the positions, a lot of the scepticism of the SNP at the time, and basically was forced to conclude that my reading of the situation wasn't quite as morally simple and cut and dry as I had been led to believe, and also had led myself to believe in part through wishful thinking, a desire to derive simplicity from a complex picture in life, a desire to exalt myself above an other somewhere else in order for me to feel like a good person or a good guy who is part of something. In the Yes Movement's case, a kind of monolithic one moral force moving, setting aside our differences and moving forward. But I came to realise a lot of that was down to branding and marketing and political intuition. So once I've accepted that I was wrong about these things I was sure I was right about, that then leads me on a process of self-interrogation, which leads me to where I am now, because the Yes Movement often talked a lot about this concept that you will hear called social justice. The social justice is a set of values and beliefs which is about equality, inclusivity, fair representation, cultural inclusivity, making sure that people have access equally across the board, and making sure that marginalised voices have a space to exist culturally so that we all get to hear different perspectives and society is more vibrant as a result. Brilliant concept, who would argue with that? However, when you actually look closer at social justice in Scotland, it's composed of a two-tier structure. In one aspect, it's theoretical. People debate and discuss the concepts of social justice, things like privilege theory, trigger warnings, equality, class, identity politics. And then there's another tier to it, which is a political component, a private sector component, a public sector component, and a cultural sector component. And those things coupled together all come to about 5 billion a year and rising, a recession-proof industry built along lines of social justice. And this is an industry where people talk often in platitudes about public service and about the value of volunteering while collecting massive salaries and filing massive expense claims for doing relatively inexpensive things. So while there is a lot of platitude around the concept of social justice, there are massive hypocrisies going on, and there are massive contradictions in a lot of the ideologies, which we will get into as the project progresses. So my feeling is that, having gone through the experience of the referendum, having become aware of the fact that I was wrong about some things, and in an attempt to rectify that lack of rationality in myself, I bring to you the Trigger Warning Project, which is a multi-platform, multimedia project which will exist on social media, which will exist in the form of journalism, opinion pieces, satirical journalism, performance poetry, and obviously music. So it will culminate in a musical project called Trigger Warning, which will be a story which deals with all of these different themes. So that's kind of the point of it. The idea is that I publish content, I gauge the reaction, and at all times I'm feeding that reaction back through my own critical faculties and reflecting as honestly as I can. As honestly as I can. And this process of coming to decisions about the nature of the discussion, not only the things that we disagree about, whether it be yes or no, or identity, or feminism, or class, or race, or gender, or whatever, but also what is the emotional constituent parts going on inside, what motivates the positions that we take, how do we arrive at decisions, are we as rational and measured as we claim or think we are, or is a lot of what we do informed by self-interest, which just so happens to converge and coalesce with other similarly self-interested people, and this gives us the illusion that we are part of a collective that's about everyone when really we're all simultaneously in it for ourselves. So quite a simple project. The project is completely self-funded and will attempt to engage every single shade, colour, creed, type of person living in Scotland in a discussion about the nature of life in Scotland across all of these different platforms, in which some people from certain backgrounds engage with this content, that content, this content. So I'm trying to cover all bases to cross-pollinate different sections of society in a discussion about where we actually are in Scotland right now, behind the curtain of constitutional politics. I hope that I haven't rabbited on too much there. I wonder if you have any suggestions for topics that I could cover, ways that I could frame it. Is there anything else that you think should be out of bounds? Is there anything that you feel that I could include or talk about? Is there any specific people who you think might shed some light on the issue that I'm displaying a lack of understanding around? I'm completely open as possible, and as I say, all of the interactions that I receive will inform the next wave of content. I hope that that's made it quite clear where I'm coming from with this, and I hope that you will subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the blog, subscribe to the SoundCloud. All of these are available if you just look up or down on whatever page you're looking on, and don't worry, I will be buying a camera and I will be learning to edit videos. Trigger warning.